All right, folks, next up we have Harry Miller, The Man in the Cars, by Gordon Eliot White. All right, coming up, Gordon. Okay, should be all set. You just use the arrows.
That's the advance.
That's the advance. I'll stand here for a minute, okay?
Thank you, Bob, and good morning. It's nice to be back in Watkins Glen. I first visited here in 1951 and 1952 when they were running the races on the streets of Watkins Glen. And as I recall, they had the Queen Catherine's Cup, and I was just told they also had the Seneca Cup, and then the Grand Prix was the Piece de Resistance. I was a freshman at Cornell in 1951 and a race fan, which led me to come over here to watch the races. While I was at Cornell, I ran a few rallies with my hot rod, one of which I actually won to the amazement of my mostly sports car competitors. My first photos are Harry Miller, one with his 91 cubic inch straight 8 engine, supercharged, and the second with a supercharger. My subject today is Harry Miller and his legacy. Miller built both racing cars and engines, and his engine designs dominated American racing for nearly 60 years. Of course, later they were known as Offenhauser engines, but they were based on Miller's design and general engine architecture. They would have lasted longer at Indianapolis if the supercharger boost pressures had not been limited to protect the competing four-can Ford engines, which couldn't take as much boost as the Offie. Griffith Borgeson has described Miller as quite simply the greatest creative figure in the history of the American racing car. Harry was born in Menominee, Wisconsin, son of German immigrants. He had very little formal schooling. Menominee was a lumber town, and he learned mechanical trades on steam engines and other heavy equipment in the lumber mills. He left Wisconsin to seek his fortune in Los Angeles, working in a bicycle shop. He took correspondence courses in various mechanical subjects, which was the only technical training he ever had. At one point, he worked as a foundry foreman, where he learned the art of casting, which became very important in his life later on. In 1960, he went to work for the Oldsmobile Company and rode as a mechanic on that year's Oldsmobile entry in the Vanderbilt Cup races on Long Island. Olds didn't do very well in the Vanderbilt Cup, and Harry returned to Los Angeles, eventually setting up a shop to produce carburetors of his own design. He patented several carburetor designs, and they were initially used as aftermarket carburetors on passenger cars. The Miller carburetor, however, turned out to be quite successful for racing cars, and led Miller to do custom work for many of the racers. The Miller shop became the winter headquarters for many of the racing people, and he had customers including Barney Oldfield, Bob Berman, and Dario Resta, which at that time were the top people in American racing. As Miller built racing equipment, his design work followed the empirical habit of Americans, learning by experiment, much as had Thomas Edison, who designed the light bulb by trying out, I think, 200 different things for his filament, and Henry Ford, neither of whom had university educations. By comparison, in Europe at the time, trained engineers led most of the technical development, and the uneducated race drivers, Jules Gau, Georges Belot, and fellow Cucurelli were called les charlatans when they designed the first overhead cam engine for Peugeot, much to the disgust of the trained engineers that worked for Peugeot. Gau drove an overhead cam Peugeot to win at Indianapolis in 1913. Bob Berman bought it, blew the engine in a race at San Diego, and took the remains to Harry Miller to have it rebuilt. Eddie Rickenbacker also, in his terms, unloaded his broken-down Peugeot on Miller, calling it the major mistake of my racing career because he made a tremendous car out of it. Miller, in the process of rebuilding the Peugeots, educated himself in the best European engine practices. The first complete car that Miller built was called the Golden Submarine. It carried one of the engines that he had designed. The engine was also perhaps to go into an aircraft. And Miller hoped to sell those engines either for racing or airplanes. In 1916, Barney Oldfield had Miller build this radical enclosed racing car powered by that engine. It was, as I say, it was painted in gold lacquer and became known as the Golden Submarine. Oldfield drove it in a number of races. It was not immensely successful, but it won a few races. At Springfield, Illinois, he crashed and the car caught fire. So after that, Barney cut off the rest of the body so he wouldn't be trapped in it. And this is the Golden Submarine after Barney had trimmed it considerably. From the Golden Submarine, Miller went on to build a few more experimental racing cars, the best of them being the TNT, after Leo Goosen, who was a trained engineer and draftsman who came from Buick, joined his staff. Goosen supplied the technical knowledge of a trained engineer that Miller lacked, and he would go on to become the preeminent race engine designer in North America. Somewhat earlier, Miller had hired Fred Offenhauser as a machinist. Offenhauser had been trained in the railroad shops, and at the time, the railroad shops are what NASA became. It was the highest level of technical work and design in the country. From the Golden Submarine, Miller went on to build a few more experimental race cars. In 1920, 4 Miller engine cars were entered Indianapolis, but none of them qualified. During the following year, Miller and driver Tommy Milton helped design a straight engine of 183 cubic inches that embodied much of the engine architecture that remained through the life of Miller and Offenhauser engines. Arvale qualified one of these 183s in Indy in 1921 and finished 10th. In 1922, Jimmy Murphy qualified with a Miller engine and won the race. In 1923, Miller competed in several European Grand Prix, and they finished well, although they didn't win a race. This next picture is of a front drive 91 cubic inch Miller car, and the man in the background with the bowler hat is Umbrella Mike Boyle. Boyle was a business agent for the Chicago Electrical Union as his day job, and you wonder how he made enough money out of being the business agent to afford race cars, but that was Chicago. Through the rest of the Roaring '20s, Miller engine cars would win 5 of 8 races at Indianapolis, even as engine sizes were reduced first to 122 inches and then to 91 inches. Supercharging was used to increase the horsepower even while engine displacements were reduced. This is Ralph Hepburn in a front drive Miller 91. This is a car I will mention again later on. At the same time, Miller was also producing a four-cylinder engine of 151 inches for racing boats. Eventually, a slightly larger four was produced for dirt track cars that are now known as sprint cars. Miller engines were the top of the line of speedboat racing in the 1920s, and eventually, band leader Guy Lombardo would win the Gold Cup in a Miller engine speedboat, which started out named My Sin, and he named it Tempo Fourth. By 1929, Miller was at the top of the heap in racing, but his and the Duesenberg brothers' tiny 91 cubic inch engines had gotten a long way from the original Indianapolis racing, which was largely stock cars with the fenders taken off. In early 1929, Eddie Rickenbacker, by then head of the American, oops, we lost it. Is it idling on something?
We got a wonky connection. Sorry, folks, we've been battling this for 2 days now. Stay away from that. Okay.
I won't touch it. This is a Miller 91 piston. This is a supercharged straight eight. Actually, this piston is out of one of Leon Dure's 1928 front drive Millers. I got it when the Smithsonian took one of Dure's cars in 1993, and it had been restored by Bob Rubin, the donor. It's still there. At the same time, Miller was also producing, well, I said that. The change that Rickenbacker pushed through the AAA contest board led to what was called the junk formula. They banned superchargers and allowed stock block engines 366 cubic inches, which was quite a bit more than any of the Miller engines really were ever built, but Miller engines continued to win in Indianapolis nonetheless. In the early 1930s, Harry designed a series of innovative chassis powered by larger 230 cubic inch engines, unsupercharged in accordance with the rules. But those were Depression years, and he couldn't sell enough 230s to keep his business going. This picture is Shorty Catlin in one of the 230. So this is one of the 230 chassis with a 16-cylinder engine, Miller engine in it. However, Harry got into the custom passenger car business, which he couldn't sell enough of them to keep his business going either. The next photo is of the engine, which I consider a pretty, sorry, I breathed on it.
It's not you, Gordon.
Okay, it's back.
There you go. We're going to make you part of the crew here.
I think this is a pretty impressive V16 Miller engine, which later went into a race car. When Miller went bankrupt, he left Los Angeles forever. And although he was broke, he was still considered a genius by people who wanted race cars. This is a Miller Ford. Preston Tucker was able to talk Henry Ford into having Miller built a series of 10 race cars, very advanced race cars, to carry the new Ford V8 engine. Unfortunately, they started building them in March for a race in May, and they were not able to test them adequately. While they had some good drivers, Ted Horn was one, 4 were able to qualify, but all of them fell out of the race in 35, largely because of the inherent problem with the steering gear, which, of course, much discouraged Henry Ford, and he sequestered the cars for a while. Eventually, they got out and were used in other ways. As I say, the passenger cars, the unsuccessful passenger cars, probably put the nail in the coffin of Miller's business. And at the bankruptcy auction, Miller's shop foreman, Fred Offenhauser, bought most of the machinery and patterns and set up his own shop to manufacture both parts and complete engines, eventually changing their name from Miller to Offenhauser, although they were, of course, based on Miller designs. This is one of the Miller Fords. And next, Gulf Oil hired Harry to build them a series of race cars. Unfortunately, they specified that they run on Gulf pump gasoline, which was not a very good idea because other people were running race cars, particularly in Indianapolis, with racing fuel, which made a lot more power. But Fred didn't have, Harry didn't have Fred or Leo to calm some of his flights of fancy. This car, you will see, has a radiator made out of tubing, chrome-plated tubing. That was a mistake. It overheated immediately, and he had to replace it with rather ugly conventional radiators. In any event, they took these cars to Indianapolis, but they had problems of all sorts getting them qualified. You see the fuel tanks were at the bottom of the frame there. Mark Dees thinks they were an aerodynamic item. I'm not sure about that, but they were certainly a hazard because when a couple of them crashed, and the next picture is of one that crashed, ruptured the fuel tank, the car burned up and killed the driver, who was George Bailey. As World War II approached, Miller moved to Detroit and designed both aircraft and marine engines for the military. Preston Tucker lured him into designing an engine for both an armored car and a fighter plane. But Harry didn't have the engineering skill or knowledge to meet the Air Corps requirements for a military engine. He was still designing empirically by trial and error. That didn't suit the military. Harry was then living in Detroit, and he died in Detroit in poverty in 1943. Now, this is Fred Offenhauser, who had taken over producing Miller engines. In the early 1930s, midgets had become a real force in racing, but they were generally powered by junk engines, motorcycle engines, and to move the show along, several people decided they needed a professional racing engine, and Offenhauser had Leo Goosen essentially cut a Miller 183 in half to produce a 97 cubic inch midget engine. It was an immediate success, and over the next till the late 70s, Offenhauser had produced 450 of those engines. And I will note some of the successes that the Offenhauser engines had. 1959 USAC, which replaced 3A as the dominant sanctioning body in American racing, held a series of Formula Libre races, pitting midgets against sports cars. And the most famous of these, held on the road course at Lime Rock, Connecticut, Roger Ward and an Offenhauser-powered Curtis defeated the cream of the world's sports cars. This is Ward and the Ken Bren midget about to pass George Constantine in an Aston Martin DBR2. Shocked the sports car world that a midget could defeat them. And I had a little success with an Offie midget. This is my car at Bonneville, 1989, where I set a midget record of 156.902, and then I set an FIA 2-liter unblown record of 153, 198. Probably the only car to set a speed record after winning top prizes in an antique show car. But the Offenhauser Indy engines, I say, were penalized by not being able to run as much boost as they would have liked. And this is Mark Alderson in the last Offie-powered car to be entered at Indy. He was in line for a qualification run when time ran out, and that was the end of run of the Offenhauser engines in Indianapolis. This, by comparison, is an Indy Offie engine, 270 cubic inch. As you can see, it's somewhat larger than Miller's 91s. The first of the Offenhauser-built Miller engines was a 255 cubic inch produced in 1935 for Kelly Patillo, who won the Indy 500 with it that year, putting the Offenhauser or Offie engine at the top of the list for serious Indy competitors. Although Leo Goosen said to his dying day that the engine was really a Miller. For the following 37 Indy races, the engine is known as Offenhauser 128. In fact, for 5 years in Indianapolis, all of the qualifying cars were Offie powered. In 1946, Fred Offenhauser sold the engine business to Lou Meyer and Dale Drake, who continued it under the Offenhauser name. As I said, the Offie was displaced at Indianapolis by the four-cam Ford engine, but it came back in the 1970s with turbocharging to win 5 more 500s. The last Offies I said qualified Indy was the last Offie to qualify came in 1980. This is a turbo Offie owned by Rolla Wallstedt. As I say, it was in line to qualify, but didn't make it. Well, the 270, 255, and later turbocharged Offies dominated championship racing for many years. And the smaller midget engine simply overwhelmed midget racing. After World War II, an Offie engine in a Curtis chassis was so dominant, it was an event if any other car or engine won a race. The 220 sprint car engine was the class on the half-mile tracks as well, though because it cost more than the modified Model A engines and other passenger car engines, it was in a minority. In 1957, the small block Chevy with many more cubic inches became competitive, and the last year an Offie won the sprint car championship was 1959. As I said, Miller died in Detroit in 1943, almost forgotten. After the war, few people remembered him or that the dominant Offenhauser engine had become life as a Miller. It was not until a dozen years after Miller's death that Griffith Borgerson, editor of Sports Car Illustrated magazine, began to write about Miller and his engines, and people began to appreciate Harry Miller. Leon Duret had taken his 2 Miller front-drive cars to France in 1929 after the last Indianapolis race before they were outlawed by the rules change. He sold them to Bugatti. They remained in France during World War II. Borgerson discovered them there in 1959, brought them back to the United States. One went to the Indianapolis Speedway Museum. By 1990, the newspaper I was working for had lost half its circulation and couldn't afford me in Washington. So I took early retirement, went to the Smithsonian as their auto racing advisor. This is a photo of me in the Dure car at Bridgehampton when I was trying to persuade Bob Rubin to donate to the Smithsonian, which he did in 1993. Borgeson's writing about Miller generated a movement among a group of car collectors to find surviving Millers and restore them. In the early 1990s, Mark Dees of Moore Park, California, Chuck Davis of Chicago, Dave Eline of Milwaukee, and Bob Sutherland of Colorado organized the Harry A. Miller Club, which each July hosts a meet at the mile track in Milwaukee, where restored Millers and other front-engine champ cars can be exercised at speed. This is a photo of the field at Milwaukee with mostly Miller cars and engines. Many of Miller's drawings and blueprints have survived. For 25 years, I've maintained an archive of more than 12,000 such drawings, the originals of which are now at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. By now, there are more Millers, many put together out of parts than Harry built. The event at Milwaukee and shows such as Pebble Beach, Amelia Island, and Hershey pay appropriate honor to Harry Arminius Miller, a giant in American racing. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Outstanding. Let me see the mic. Very good. Do we have any questions for Gordon White? Oh, we got several. I'll walk my way across the room. Joe Freeman.
Gordon, you and I have worked together for a long time. I'm interested to just comment. There are a couple of things that remain, you might say, in question that I'd like to bring up. But the first is that actually the design for the double overhead camshaft engine, original, the 183, was a result of the frustration of Tommy Milton with getting Duesenberg single overhead cam engines that he didn't think were up to level, but he did steal the specifications of the Duesenberg engines and brought them to Miller, which produced the original double overhead cam Miller, which then he began to win races with a car called the Durant Special, and eventually, of course, both, well, as I mentioned in my lecture, why Jimmy Murphy and Harry Hartz got a hold of engines, and eventually then Cliff Durant built, I think, a field of 5 cars that were entered. I'm interested, and I don't know if you've ever investigated this, but Jim O'Keefe and I were working hard on this question, and we believe actually that the first true full Miller racing car was called the Pan American, built prior to the Golden Submarine. It's never been fully accredited as such, and I'm wondering whether you have any comment on that. The final comment is just that there has been, as it's been said, there is really a real cult of Miller lovers, me being one, although I don't own one. But that Miller's achievements, at least prior to losing his company, were a result of competition that was from both Louis Chevrolet and Fred and Duesenberg, who introduced supercharging at the Indianapolis 500, and others. And so it's a fascinating era of American development in which tires, fuels, and metals, lubricants, all of these things were, in essence, developed in the board track era, largely by Harry Miller and the Duesenbergs and Louis Chevrolet. But anyway, my comment is rather too long, except to say that I'd be interested to know if you've investigated the Pan American as a car, and whether or not indeed it was the first true full car built by Miller.
Well, from what I know, that's an unfounded rumor that might possibly be true. It's clear that Miller took advice from Milton and other drivers, car owners. He didn't do a lot of on-track testing, a little. We have a few photos, but most of the testing was done in races, and if things didn't work, they came back to Harry and said, you got to fix this, you got to fix that. And that continued through Offenhauser, Meyer, and Drake, and Drake Engineering. But I'm not really aware of definite knowledge on the Pan American.
One more question. Sorry, we have time just for one more because we have you two guys fight it out.
When did Henry, or did he have any interest in aerodynamics and the streamlining of his cars?
Well, you could possibly say the Golden Submarine was an experiment in aerodynamics. It was certainly more aerodynamic than contemporary race cars at that point. But it did not prove to be a world beater, and as we saw, Barney Oldfield felt he was likely to be trapped in a closed car and took it off. The side fuel pods on the Gulf Miller cars, if you look at them carefully, and perhaps I can go back, if you see, I'm going to really screw it up. Well, I'll try not to. Okay, it's back. The side pods there could be seen as an airfoil, and it was thought that perhaps Miller was designing them to give downforce. That's as much as I'm aware of serious aerodynamics. Of course, the front drive cars, without a drive shaft under the driver, allowed them to sit lower, and they had less frontal area, so that was an aerodynamic advance right there.
Gordon, one last. Gentleman in the back asked, has any of the tooling survived? Offenhauser or Miller, what have you?
Not that I'm aware of. I've got photos of some of the Miller machines. Offenhauser bought some at the bankruptcy auction in '33. He's also said to have taken some out of the back door before the auction. Meyer and Drake undoubtedly got some when they bought out Fred Offenhauser. I knew John Drake and talked to him. I don't think anything had survived from Miller's shop. His machinery was run at first by overhead shafts, as machine shops were run in those days. Eventually they electrified some of the machinery, but machinery from the late 20s was probably not really useful by the time that John Drake went out of business.
Real quick.
Yeah, some of the patterns have survived. Bob McConnell has a number of patterns. Kendall Merritt has a number of patterns. Dean Butler had quite a few, and he sold them to somebody in Troy, Michigan. So yes, patterns survive. Unfortunately, during the Meyer and Drake years, patterns that were clearly obsolete were thrown away, and some of them were burned up, but a few people rescued some of those obsolete patterns. So a number have survived. So if you really want to cast your own Miller 255 block, you can do it.
Gordon, thank you again. Thanks very much.